He's already making faces at me. We've got, this is going to be fun. I haven't had Robert on the show yet. I'm not sure exactly why, but we have a good reason to do it now. So, or have had for the last year or so. Robert is my business partner, best friend. We've known each other since 1993, when we both got jobs at the same university in Santa Clara University, and got offices across the hall from one another. Landed up hanging out most of the time together, doing our research together, starting a business together, and we're still together after all these years. So, hey, Robert.
Hey, Yaron. I guess this is our 30th anniversary.
It is. God. That's right. So it'll be September or late August. Yep. Will be a 30th anniversary. It's my 40th wedding anniversary and my 30th Robert anniversary. So very cool. Very cool. I didn't remember that.
I didn't either till you mentioned it. And it was
1993. Wow. It's 2023. Shit, 30 years. All right. I'm not sure how we recover from that one. So as you guys know, we have Super Chat is live, so you can ask questions of me or Robert. We'll be talking about kind of the work we're doing now, or some of the work we're doing now, and we'll just see where the conversation goes. And you guys get to shape the conversation because you guys get to ask questions. You can ask questions about finance, and we'll talk some about finance, particularly as it relates to kind of tech. But you can ask about finance. Both Robert and I, PhDs in finance, and Robert is a portfolio manager at our hedge fund. So it's all good. All right. So for the last year or something, we've been working on a project that really was instigated by Robert, called Ingenuism, with the idea of really looking at progress, innovation, but particularly focused on kind of what's happened in the 21st century. So, Robert, why don't you just describe kind of what led you to think about this? What are the big questions that were intriguing you that led you to come up with this?
Well, pretty early on in our work together, consulting, we looked at venture capital, and we looked at it from a little bit different perspective than most people. We looked at it from an academic quantitative perspective and tried to get a sense for what would be the indicators of why venture capital would either succeed or fail. And that's a whole nother ball of wax. But what came out of that was I started teaching a class on Silicon Valley and venture capital at Santa Clara University. And it was very different than your traditional entrepreneurial finance class. And as we got out of the first internet boom and into the second internet boom, the social networking boom, my general here's how it works story continued to be very satisfying. I kind of felt like I had it figured out. And then we hit around 2015, and we started to see a sort of unprecedented success. I mean, we've had some extraordinarily successful companies in the United States. AT&T was probably the first that really changed the world.
Maybe Standard Oil, even before that.
So sorry, I should have qualified technology companies.
Yeah, technology company.
Although Standard Oil was a technology company in its day, but information technology companies.
Chemistry company, yes.
And so we had this new evolution of technology companies that didn't really fit the story that I had been telling. It didn't not fit, but That's when I started thinking about Ingenuism and why it was that, starting around 2015, we started to get these kind of unprecedented results. And the numbers are just staggering. You're talking about companies that are creating value that are the equivalent to the GDP of a major country.
So companies like?
Well, the big one is, of course, Apple. Most people realize that Apple is an extremely innovative and very successful company. But what most people don't remember is that despite being very successful in the 1980s, Apple was really flailing in the 1990s. And it was arguably saved by some combination of an investment by Bill Gates and the first internet boom, where technology generally was rewarded. But coming out of the end of that and the bust, Apple was a marginal computer company. And then it became a consumer electronics company, and it did it in a series of product introductions that all built on each other, but that were as innovative or more innovative than the original Macintosh, because they have changed the world in ways. The idea of a smartphone really wasn't on the radar when Apple first introduced the iPhone. And today, most of us run our lives on smartphones. They've changed the world. When I say that, I mean literally the impact that a smartphone has on us here in the United States is modest compared to what the impact a phone has. Is probably not an iPhone, but a smartphone has on someone who doesn't have reliable electricity, doesn't have reliable wired networks, doesn't. It's really been amazing. But then you also have Google, you have Amazon, and you have other companies that are coming up. These are the three that are currently have had the biggest impact, along with Microsoft. But if we're having this conversation in 20 years, I think we'll be talking about a whole different set of companies.
Yeah, and there was also the big social media companies also succeeded enormously during that period. Many of them have come down to earth a little bit over the last few years, but particularly Facebook just took off, and the kind of valuation of something like WhatsApp, and you would have never predicted a messaging platform would
no business model, right?
No business model, no revenue model would be as successful and as impactful as, for example, WhatsApp has on an international scale.
Exactly. And, everyone questioned Google buying YouTube for $1.7 billion. It turned out to be, one of the bargains of the century. Or Facebook buying Instagram. Facebook, we probably wouldn't even be talking about Facebook if they hadn't bought Instagram for $1 billion. That gives you a sense of the surprise that people thought those numbers were very large, and it turned out that relative to the impact they could have both on the business and on the customers, they turned out to be very small.
So given the success of all this, and we're already getting some questions in. One is from Ian. Ian, you have no clue how relevant to why he's asking about Silvergate and Silicon Valley Bank. So we'll get to that, I promise. Robert has a lot to say about both Silvergate and Silicon Valley Bank. The bloodbath today was interesting, and then okay, Michael has. All right, we got some entertaining questions. Good. Mel,
let's just shift gears here. Come back to Ingenuism later. I'll weave it in when I can.
Now we'll go back to it. We'll get to it. They used us covering topics and then doing the Q&A, the questions afterwards. So far, so good. So you're seeing this incredible success, 2015. I think we're all living through it. To a large extent. It was hard to tell at the time. Is this real? Is it this market just being frothy? And to some extent it was, but it always is. That's not surprising with new tech. But what got you thinking about this as something different, something new, different than maybe Web 1.0? And what is it about this that got you thinking about maybe something new as explaining it all?
Well, when you have dramatically, different and enormously, much bigger results, there's almost always a positive feedback that's built into it. That's what generates the oomph. And in this case, it led me to thinking about, what really is behind progress. And, I think we both agree, and if you really get down to it, most people who have thought about it would agree that there's something about human ingenuity that is essential to progress, that explains why humans advance by virtue of their own effort at a much different scale and a much different speed than any other species. And once we got thinking about it and really trying to model it a little bit to think of how would we consider the world inside of this context, the big aha was that connection is extraordinarily important. And what had changed in the 21st century was the world gotten much more connected. There've been lots of people who've looked at connection over time. You can look at post rates or whether two spots were connected by a telephone wire or by a railroad. But that's a completely different level of connection where it's slow, it's basically analog, versus what the internet offered. And then if you look at these companies that were wildly successful, they all offered an increase in connection while benefiting from that connection. So Google took the world of the web and made it accessible, searchable. You could find what you were looking for. If you weren't searching in the 1990s, you have no idea how good you have it. And then, currently the large language model chatbots may be taking that to a whole nother level, which we've talked about. And I think it will be super interesting in the next 5 years. But you had the same thing with Amazon. You had the same thing with Apple. Microsoft did an extraordinary job of shifting gears from really being a desktop company to becoming a connection company, and that works in a lot of different dimensions. And so once I recognized that, then it all sort of fell in place, because what does connection really get you? It gets you the sharing of knowledge, and it gets you collaboration. And if you look at these companies, they're all about sharing knowledge and collaborating. They're connecting people in ways that didn't exist before. And then that itself creates value that they can capture, but then it also feeds back into overall progress for humanity in general.
So let's walk through what it is about connection that creates value here. I mean, even as you said, even in the telegraph was a massive innovation, and by connecting people, it created opportunities to creating huge value, partially because suddenly you could make decisions from across the other side of the world, and partially because you had more information, and then collaboration. How does collaboration fit in? How does that add value?
Well, there's sort of three dimensions in how I think about it. One is the basic sharing of knowledge. So there's connection in terms of existing knowledge. And if you have access to it, and today we do, to basically all of the knowledge on the planet, or 99% of the knowledge on the planet, that allows you to build on what has already been discovered instead of starting from ground zero. Now, there are advantages to starting from ground zero, because when you build on what has already been discovered, you tend to absorb the existing paradigms, and sometimes they're not right, or they're not fully fleshed out. There's something on an alternative, but you have the option to do both. And then the second is that building your own paradigm is that there's a much greater reward to discovering new knowledge and new information, whether it's a new business model or a new manufacturing technique or a new way of providing computing cycles or software package. It's all much more valuable in a connected world, because the entire world can benefit off of it. So, if we were living on an island and we were talking about innovating, the amount of time that we would spend on innovation would be very different, because the two of us could benefit from it. So we'd focus on, well, what does benefit us? And we wouldn't worry about scaling. And it would be very, very different than what we have in Silicon Valley, where the incentive is to build things that are going to have the biggest impact for the most people. And that's because of connection. And then the third piece is collaboration. It's very easy to think about innovation is happening with, an individual genius like a Thomas Edison that is a savant in a particular area and is willing to work really hard and is experimenting and not giving a crap because it's continually moving towards that model. Most major projects that happen, they require much more input than a single person can provide. And it used to be you would have to bring all those people together, physically together, in order to work on them. So the Manhattan Project was a physical, bring everyone together and have them work on it. And that requires the kind of commitment that rarely happens for a major project. And now that's just not the case. We've certainly seen it since the pandemic that people can collaborate and people can produce great results without even being in the same hemisphere.
And of course, the connection, we now have 8 billion people, or somewhere close to that, 6 billion, 5 billion connected in a real way through the internet, connected to one another, connected to one another, connected to all the knowledge in the world, and then can leverage their ideas across all of that. So when Apple sells iPhone, it's not limited to an American, this is all connected to globalization as well, I think. So you're not just limited to selling to an American, American market. Of course, if it's a digital product like Google, you're not limited, instantaneously you can sell across the entire planet. And suddenly you've got this massive market. It's interesting. I think it was the professor, I think out of Chicago, one of the finance guys who talked about when they talked about CEO pay and why CEO pay was rising so much. And one of the arguments he made was, well, you used to manage a company that sold to 350 million people. Now you're managing a company that has the potential to sell to 8 billion people. It's a whole different ball game. It's like LeBron James is going to make a lot more money than Michael Jordan because Michael Jordan, it wasn't a global industry, and now it is. Now you've got billions of people watching, so you can leverage all those resources.
Absolutely. I mean, the rate limiting factor today, I would argue, is coordinating that collaboration, because we've moved into a new paradigm, and it takes time to figure things out. You have to try a lot of things. You have to have a lot of things not work. You have to then figure out what is working and how to combine it with other things that are working. And this is a decade-long process. I mean, if you look at past innovations, the steam engine is a good example of an innovation that was wildly important. It was the first time that you could really turn energy into mechanical action in a meaningful way. And so suddenly the limit of human power and animal power was superseded by you can now turn energy into mechanical power. But it took decades to figure out, what all the applications were. And that is, I don't know if it'll take decades because things seem to be moving a lot faster, but that is relatively simple compared to coordinating hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of people around the globe that you used to have in one office park or one campus in New Jersey. But it's much more powerful because you have access to all the 8 billion people as opposed to, some tiny fraction of that.
Yeah, and you get feedback so much faster. So when things don't work or things do work, you get feedback immediately. So experimentation is accelerated and feedback mechanisms accelerated. At this pace, maybe within a few years, we'll figure out why TikTok should exist. And if you heard the latest filter that TikTok has, is you add this filter and it takes your face and it makes you look the best that you could look.
I thought that was already being used by everyone on the internet.
So this
except for us. This
is new. So it's now, teenage girls can see what they could look like if they were perfect.
Yeah, that seems like really healthy.
Yes, very healthy. So maybe something will evolve out of this that's positive. I don't see it yet, but maybe
I guess that's why the metaverse will eventually take off, because people, won't be willing to show their actual face in the real world.
Right. In the metaverse, I can be anybody I want. I can use any face I want. So connection is super important, and you can see. I think I've seen a graph where you can see as growth, technological growth in particular, and new telecommunication I mean, we published that graph actually in one of our Ingenuism newsletters. By the way, if you're interested in this whole area, we do a regular podcast and a YouTube show. You can subscribe to the Ingenuism channel on YouTube. You can subscribe to it as a podcast on other podcasting apps. Also, for a while there, we were writing a Substack, and that is available on ingenuism.com. So you can go and read some of the stuff. We started writing this a year ago. Don Watkins was working with us over a year ago.
Yeah, it was almost 2.5 years ago.
Really?
Yeah.
All right. All I have is pre-COVID and post-COVID.
Yeah, it was post-COVID.
Everything else is good.
Early post-COVID.
So so there's a lot of written material there that you can find. So I encourage you to do that. So, there's this direct correlation between the connectivity technology and progress, and connectivity now has exploded. I mean, it's hard to imagine more connectivity than what we have. And yet, yes.
The chatbots suddenly look like there could be a whole new level. And
so how do chatbots actually help us connect?
Well, if you take the evolution of search, you say all the information's out there. There's some amount of information. And the question is, how can you access it? And the big innovation for Google was to actually find what you're looking for, to make search effective. And then Google's been slowly adding things like some related questions that you might not have thought to ask, but are readily available on your search page. So you're not really looking for a website, you're looking for information. And the chatbots just appear to have the ability, although with poor reliability in terms of staying factual, but to have the ability to synthesize information in ways that, maybe a really smart junior high or a high school student would do. So it's almost like having an RA that can go out and grab the information for you. And then it's also, it's one less step. If you're reading an article and you come across a concept that you're not familiar with, you could always Google that and find an explanation pretty quickly. But with the chatbots, they'll go out and find it for you and deliver it in a way that can be, and you can refine the search so it can be very close to what you would have wanted immediately. And I think that is a way of connecting to information that is fundamentally different, in part because it's easier. And the easier it is to access information, the more connected we are to it, because we only have so much time and so much energy and so much attention. And this is why, you like to talk about getting implants in your brain and having the internet already, flowing straight in your, and that would be even a dramatically higher level of connection. And there's no reason to think that something like that, it probably won't be what we think it is, but that something like that won't show up at some point.
And, people are very down in the chat boxes over the last few weeks, I guess, because there are all these disappointing results, and chat boxes, Chat GPT acts like a teenage boy sometimes, or girl, depending. And it some of that is made up, some of it's real. But so why should anybody take this seriously? Well,
I think Google has probably had a chatbot. I mean, there was some talk about that researchers were concerned that the chatbot had become sentient back over maybe 18 months ago. And so this is all very, very new. Yeah, and so if we use the search analogy, we're not actually at the Google stage, we're at the Alta Vista stage, where you look at search and go, this doesn't work at all. Why am I bothering? And it was because, well, this is the best we got. And then it improves, and it doesn't improve linearly. There is incremental improvement, but there tend to be major jumps forward. And, we've had whatever we've had in the initial development, but there's every reason to think that it'll become much more refined and much more useful as we move forward.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, one can only imagine how this technology will improve dramatically. And the fact that I think they've made it public is probably going to accelerate its improvement, partially because of connection, right? More people giving feedback, more people interacting with it, more And that's exactly how this kind of technology improves itself, by more interaction.
And I think it's representative of, although it's kind of ironic that it was Microsoft who really just threw it out there, but of how people see the potential for progress in iterated learning. There's one model is you try and fix it behind the scenes, you try and fix it and make it and refine it and then release it when it's as good as it can be. And there's still going to be some problems, but they'll be minimized. And, this is the NASA model, because when you're sending astronauts into space, you don't have much room for error. It's wildly expensive and very slow. And when I say very slow, I mean that you don't get the progress nearly as quickly as if you're willing to go out there and fail, because you learn much more from your failures than you do from your successes. And so the fact that Microsoft was willing to throw it out there, and of course, that was after it had already been released by OpenAI, that was definitely a nod to the SpaceX approach or generally the Silicon Valley approach of move fast and break things. Yeah. Except that's often used to refer to move fast and screw things up and then ask for forgiveness. This is actually a strategy of we're going to take the technology out. We know it's not going to work the first time, but we're going to release it in a way where we can learn as much as possible, as quickly as possible. And we're going to make it really good, really soon.
And, this is just one application of AI. I mean, the model behind it is going to actually contribute to our knowledge, not just through connection, but through just it discovering things that we can't do. I mean, I was just reading an article about AI's ability to identify cancer, at least with breast cancer, where you get a lot of screens, so it can learn. And it's just as good as radiologists today, maybe even better in some cases, and that's only going to improve.
Yes, AI is very good at pattern recognition, and when you have a situation where it can be used as a front end, even today, it's wildly more efficient. I mean, a lot of radiology was being sent to India to be read initially, and now you can automate that on the front end. And then there are going to be situations that the AI hasn't learned enough to be able to handle. And this is always it's that 1% that is always the trick when you get into the real world. And it'll be the 1% as well when you get to actually accepting the results from a chatbot's internet search that come back synthesized, and you have to have confidence that it's not made up, and getting the last 1% of the crap that's made up, since it's coming from the internet, is going to be very, very hard. But there's still value of having it 99% right, whether it's radiology or a research project or even driving a car.
Mm-hmm. So 20 years from now, how valuable is going to be AI broadly? Or
I have no idea, but probably really valuable.
I mean, not in dollar terms, but in terms of scale. I mean, it strikes me that it changes the world at some point. That at some point, it's in everything that we interact with.
Well, it's a really interesting technology because it is very, very good at pattern recognition and then working out the effective ways to optimize within a particular pattern regime. And so I think it'll have a huge impact on things like drug discovery or the testing of new materials, of figuring out, let's just take an example I'm going to make up off the top of my head. So if we had a room temperature superconductor, that would change the world. Mm-hmm. And a room temperature superconductor at a reasonable pressure is a hard nut to crack. There's just a lot going on, and we don't completely understand the physics. And it's something that I think an AI could lead researchers into a particular area that they might not have seen before, and then that would change the world. And it would impact our lives massively, although indirectly. More directly, you can imagine that the AI becomes, and we've talked about this, the AI becomes, a literal personal assistant. It handles a lot of your life. You know, the 99% of the routine tasks that you don't want to handle, but you have to because nobody knows what you want in the same way that you do. Well, you know, a personalized AI could learn that and could then be providing you with, you know, itineraries or plans or scheduling or booking you or what, you know, there's just, the sky is the limit. But the thing that is most interesting to me on this isn't on the technology side, but it's on the business model side, because AI is a lot like most connection technologies, where there's a massive upfront investment where you train the model. And then there's ongoing improvement that comes from people using the model. So there's the positive feedback, and the marginal cost to providing it, we can expect to be very low. Now, it's very expensive to train the model, so upfront it's expensive. And depending on how you amortize that, you might even say it's expensive to use the model, although given that the current models are being offered for free, I don't know, you know, up to 1 million uses or something, that it can't be that expensive to use it. And so you have this situation where you're going to have AIs that have been trained, and that basically tells you how good the AI is. And then it's going to be, the obvious price point is free because the marginal cost of providing is so low. But there does need to be some way to monetize it, to both cover the training costs and also to make it worth offering. And it's not obvious how you do that. It's easy with search. It's easy with social media. And basically, everything that's free is generally advertising supported.
Yep.
It's not as clear how you do that with an AI. So it's that, to me, I think is the most interesting piece of it, because it seems like we're going to get a very rich market where there'll be AIs that are relatively less powerful, that are completely free, and other ones that you subscribe to in the same way that you might subscribe to Netflix. And maybe it's a similar cost, and then maybe there are super powerful AIs that, you know, cost a lot more, that researchers or universities, that there's going to be a very rich market, but that over time, more and more of it will be free.
Mm-hmm.
And if you think about the global impact, you talk about 8 billion people with smartphones and access to these kind of intelligent agents, that'll be huge. It'll change people's lives, and it'll just be a spillover from the work that's being done now.
Yeah, I mean, it'll make people dramatically more productive. I mean, people always fear technology is going to take jobs, and fear technology is going to make people poor because they can't, but it does exactly the opposite, because it helps everybody become more productive, because it gives them access to information and to abilities they wouldn't otherwise have.
If you want to argue the opposite of that, the burden of proof is on you, because that's how it's always been. And if you think through, you know, how AI can be used, I don't see any reason to think it'll be different.
So Shazbot wants to know if you've seen the movie Ex Machina.
I have.
Comment on it?
Well, I mean,
we do movie reviews in the Yaron Brook Show. Go for it.
Well, it's been a while since I saw it, but basically the idea is you know, AIs are used to create sex bots. I mean, that's not exactly it wasn't that movie, but that is basically the idea. And then if you are trying to make an AI that is very human-like, that it certainly could, you know, become an independent entity and kill its maker. But I would be interested in talking to someone who's thought more about the movie. I found it to be entertaining, but it was basically Frankenstein. And that story comes out over and over. There's something that appeals to us as human beings. And of course, AI will definitely be used in the sex industry.
Oh yeah, I mean, almost all progress in technology, you know, spurred on by the sex industry. There's a new movie out in the theaters, I thought recently, with this doll.
Megan.
Yeah. This
Megan
is exactly the kind of movie I don't go to see.
Well, it's actually, so I watched it streaming.
Oh, you did? Okay.
And it it was actually really interesting because it has all the Frankenstein elements to it. You know, they tell the doll, you know, keep this girl safe and you know, protect her physically and emotionally. And so it, you know, starts killing people who bully her, and it makes complete sense given its orders. Except then at the end, it turns on its creator and on the little girl, and this is not consistent. So it's the same idea as Ex Machina, where it's like, you know, I'm not going to do what they tell me to do anymore, and that's the normal ending. But it was done in a way where you could also interpret it as taking care of the girl's emotional well-being. So if you think about taking care of a young girl's emotional well-being, so you're an AI and you're given this instruction. So, you know, it's pretty easy to say, I'm going to protect her physically, and I'm going to kill the nasty dog next door. I'm going to kill the bully. I'm going to kill, you know, that's easy to write, but how are you going to take care of her emotionally? So you want to be a friend, you connect with her, you give her, and so she becomes very connected with you. And then you're connected to the internet, and you're learning, and you come to realize that as the AI, that this isn't the healthiest relationship for this little girl, that she's completely attached to a machine and starting to not be attached to, and the little girl's parents have been killed in a car accident. And but you know, the alternative relationship in the movie would be with her aunt, who has taken her in and given her the murderous AI. And so in the end, the AI is destroyed, which it's hard to imagine how it would be destroyed because it's been sort of superpowered all the way through. Except that if you roll it back, you'd be like, okay, well, if the machine is learning, which is what it should be doing, and it figures out that actually it has not been acting in the best interest of this girl's emotional health, then it would have to sever the tie with the girl, because the girl's very attached to it. So it can't just turn itself off and say, you know, I screwed up, because then the girl will be very sad. So, you know, it becomes a overtly murderous machine, and then all of a sudden loses, is a good way to reconnect her with her aunt and sever the tie. And I'm pretty sure that's not how they wanted you to interpret it, but it made the movie a lot more enjoyable for me.
Did the machine commit suicide in order to save the girl's emotional well-being?
Basically, that's the way that's the way that you could interpret it. You know, not overtly, but by allowing itself to be beaten in the end.
All right. Here's another AI question. Could you comment on the highly interactive neural network AI on the model of DeepL?
Deep learning?
Deep learning, I guess.
I don't know. I mean, it would be silly for us to comment on that, because this is not the area we're expert in. Ask me about Silvergate and
we'll get on Silicon Valley Bank.
So you get into the weeds, then your listeners are probably are better suited for this. So I'm going to pass.
All right.
Instead of making
passing on neural network instead of just making stuff up. So connectivity is crucial. But you know, one of the crucial things for innovation is, you know, what do you do with all this knowledge? You go out there and try new things, experimentation, and with that comes, of course, failure. So talk a little bit about exploration and failure, and how they fit in with this model of learning and progress.
So progress means that you're learning new things, and you know, one of the things I've gotten out of thinking about this is that we use the word learning without applying any distinction. So most of us think of learning as like we open up a book and we read it and we learn some new things. So that's absolutely a legitimate way of learning, but that's not the learning we're talking about. That's important because it allows you to, it facilitates the second more powerful kind of learning, which is discovering new things. And those things can be, you know, factual, they can be empirical, but they're things, it's knowledge that didn't exist in the world before. And that's what drives progress. If the knowledge body is static, then you don't have any progress. I mean, there's nothing to build on. There's something to build on, but nothing's being built. And so the kind of learning that really matters and that is amplified by connectivity is the new information, new knowledge, new practices. And that is something that sometimes is done theoretically. But even in the areas that you think of it as being done theoretically, it's usually there's a massive implementation issue. So you figure out the physics of a transistor, but then you have to actually get a transistor to work in the real world. And that you figure out the idea behind electric current and a light bulb, but then you have to figure out how you're actually going to make it happen. And so that kind of learning of actually making things in the world, it does require a lot of experimentation, meaning that you try things, you generally fail, and you don't try things randomly. You then try the next thing based on what you learned from the previous failure. And the problem with the not applying distinction learning is that in the first type of learning, the book learning, I'll call it, is failure is just bad. If I give you a book and you're supposed to read it and learn what's in it, and then I give you a test and you can't answer any of the questions, then you didn't read the book. I mean, you failed, and it's definitely bad. But it really is a failure of reading the book, and that isn't the same as if I ask you to write a new book by learning all these new things. Then you have to go out and you try things, and there's going to be a lot more failure than likely successes. So for every page of the book, that's new book that you're creating, there might be 10 things that you tried that didn't work, and so they never made it into the book. And that's what you see in Silicon Valley, where for every company that we see is a wild success and going public, and there are 10 companies that were trying to do a similar thing. I don't mean similar in sort of just trying to do the same thing, but the same kind of ambitious, very very large potential activity, and it just didn't work out. And it didn't work out for whatever reason, and we don't know because we never hear about those. And so when you have both of those existing in the human condition, but we grow up with the first kind of learning and the first kind of failure, it colors how we think about failure for the rest of our lives, unless we make a concerted effort. And this isn't true for everybody, but for the majority of people, then you're stuck with failure is bad.
Yep.
And what we really want people to grow up with is failure is bad if you didn't put in the work or you didn't learn from it. Otherwise, failure is absolutely to be expected, and we can even celebrate it because it means that you're doing something. And that's a key part of Ingenuism, is that this kind of learning is generally in the process of doing things. If you think about where you apply your ingenuity, when you're trying to get something done. And it could be very simple, something you're doing around the house, to trying to design a rocket ship that'll go to Mars. All that full spectrum, as long as you're doing things, you have the opportunity to apply your ingenuity. Whereas if you're not doing interesting, challenging things, then the opportunity to apply your ingenuity is going to be very limited.
And part of Ingenuism also deals with kind of the culture that is necessary, the environment that is necessary to kind of breed this kind of attitude towards failure and towards progress and towards connectivity. I mean, we know, for example, that there are cultures within even the US, but certainly internationally, there are cultures that are less accepting of failure. Europe is well known as, if you fail, you're out, you're done. If you do a startup and you don't succeed, you're done. Whereas Silicon Valley is, I wouldn't say no big deal, but you're expected to have a failure on your resume, and people would be surprised if you didn't. Almost all the great entrepreneurs testament to that. And people build businesses around failure. We talked about SpaceX. SpaceX is a great example where they failed to learn. But Amazon also has this amazing culture of allowing failure.
Absolutely. And this last piece, because it's clear that a supportive environment is going to play a huge role in progress. We see that across time, at different times, there are different environments, and progress shows up when it's an environment that supports learning in all of its depth. And then there's also across geographies. And, our favorite example, my favorite example, I don't know if it's your favorite example, but is North Korea and South Korea, where
Yeah.
you have two very different environments. You have basically the exact same people, and you have an extraordinary divergence of progress. And it's not the only example. We saw the same thing in East Germany and West Germany. And what was super interesting about the Germanys is when they were reunited, you find out that it wasn't, it was confirmed that it was the environment and not the people. Because
well, it took a generation, I think, there's a certain residue of the culture in Eastern Germany, and that has to kind of die off and be replaced by a better culture. But yeah, it's the environment you create.
And the details of that are, one of the things that's clear is that in a supportive environment, people have the opportunity to do interesting things. And, what does that mean in practice is something that I grapple with. If we believe that freedom is essential here, because if you're just doing what someone else tells you, you're not applying your ingenuity. If you're doing what someone else tells you as here's the task and go and figure it out, and you have some agency over it, then you're applying your ingenuity. So there's a certain level of freedom within a team or in a company, in an organization, in a society, that is essential. And how do we have this weird dichotomy, in the United States, but I'd say in the world as a whole, where we talk a lot about freedom. We have a commitment to freedom. We have some areas that we're extremely free, and then we have other areas that are not. And how that dissonance exists and what we can do about it. And because we have to be in some sort of unfortunate equilibrium where, both these things can exist simultaneously, and we don't seem to be moving out of it, versus having, and I don't have a predefined idea of exactly what it means, but to have a truly free society where people they are given the full benefit of being able to apply their ingenuity. That I think would make a huge difference. And it's something that, I don't have an answer for, but maybe AI can figure it out for us.
Well, we see what freedom does at the margin, right? North Korea, South Korea. So we see what it does there. And you would think that people would say, I wonder if we extrapolate more freedom. That is, let's go even further along this line and see what happens. And it seems that beyond a certain level, there is definitely resistance in populations to going that extra mile, and that's part of what we're trying to educate people about and trying to get rid of that resistance. All right, so we have a few questions. You guys can ask. I won't say about anything, because let's try to stick to the areas that we've talked about, or areas that you can project. Robert has, as you can see, if Robert doesn't think he knows something about something, he'll just say, nah, I'm not going to answer that. So ask questions where you think he might have something to say about it. So Super Chat is open, so feel free to ask questions. Let's see, where should we go with this? I'm looking at these. All right, let's do Silicon Valley. So thoughts on big finance news today: Silvergate collapse and the run on Silicon Valley Bank.
Well, this is really interesting because it's the end game of basically what was created by a long period of zero interest rates. So, and it's easy to see this with hindsight, and we were talking about it in advance, but it's just very much clicking together. So for listeners who don't know, Silvergate is a San Diego-based bank that just was a traditional small community bank that sort of rotated, it pivoted into crypto and became the nation's crypto bank. And so it grew very rapidly in the late teens and early 20s. Because it was the place where you would go if you were banking crypto. Now, crypto has there's an increasingly hate, but there's always been a love-hate relationship with U.S. regulatory authorities, and so there weren't very many banks where you could actually change dollars into, say, Bitcoin. And Silvergate was committed to being that and facilitating transfers without having to do that. And they were talking about creating a stable coin. They bought the Libra technology that Facebook was putting together for a stable coin to be used on Facebook. It was all very exciting, and it was the most expensive bank in the country not that long ago, about 18 months ago. And the reason it was successful, because it was operatingly successful, is as a traditional bank, it takes deposit and it invests that money at a spread and collects the spread. So most banks, they take deposits and they invest in, they make loans.
Yeah.
Silvergate was that kind of bank. It was primarily a real estate bank in Southern California, very plain vanilla. But when they rotated into crypto, they became more of a take deposits and invest into securities. So they grew from 800 million in deposits to 12 billion in deposits, or some number. I made those up, but they're close.
And what kind of securities did they invest in?
Well, so if you put yourself back a year, and we've talked about this in the context of stablecoins, but it applies to anybody who's trying to live off of a spread, is you're getting all these deposits for free, because if you're investing in Bitcoin, you don't care about getting 1% on your cash deposits. You want to make your 100% on your Bitcoin. And so you get all these deposits free, but if you put them into treasury bills, you make 25 or 30 basis points. So your spread is tiny, and you're a very ambitious bank, so you're spending a lot on technology. You have overhead. You want to pay yourself a lot. So Silvergate was probably running around $150 million in annual expenses. So you do the math. If you have $12 billion in deposits and you invest it at 30 basis points, it doesn't really work. But if 30 basis points is 0.3%. But if you go out farther into the yield curve, so you go out to a longer duration, you don't invest in very short-term treasury bills, or you go into riskier things like mortgage-backed securities, that give you a higher yield, well, then maybe you can get 3%. And you're doing really well if you got $12 billion of deposits at zero cost and you're making 3% on it. It's 10 times as much money, and you go from not making enough money to cover your expenses to being wildly profitable. And this is basically the same thing as Silicon Valley Bank. Silicon Valley Bank has a different business model, but they bank startups and VCs, and startups and VCs also don't care about earning 1% interest. A VC writes not literally writes, but figuratively writes a $50 million check to a technology company in Silicon Valley. Basically, Silicon Valley Bank just takes $50 million out of the VC's partnership account and puts it into the startup company's account. It's super easy, and then they provide great service. They don't pay any interest, but they don't care about interest. They're happy with the service. And of course, venture capital has been booming for the last 5 years until last year. And so Silicon Valley Bank's deposits, it didn't grow like Silvergate's grew, like by a factor of 15. But Silicon Valley Bank's deposits exploded as well, because all this money was sloshing around venture capital, and a lot of it's finding its way into Silicon Valley banks. And they did the exact same thing. They invested in securities that gave them enough yield that they could be a very profitable bank. And they were also a very highly valued bank a year ago. But you fast forward to today, and interest rates have gone way up, and all the securities that you bought at 3% now look terrible, because you go out and buy treasuries and get 5%, and your cost of funds, if you were to go out and borrow yourself, would be, say, 6%. And this is essentially what happened to the savings and loan industry in the 1980s. Is they went from paying 3% on deposits and lending mortgages at 6% and taking 3% spread, to paying 9% on deposits and only getting 6% on the mortgages, and the whole industry went bankrupt. Well, it's the same old story. And so today, now, if you could hold your deposits, this can work. And what happened to the thrifts is all the deposits started leaving, because money market funds were paying 12%. Mm-hmm. But what happened to Silvergate was crypto went into its winter, and FTX failed, and Silvergate had a lot of deposits from FTX. And so your 12 billion deposits, suddenly 6 billion, they say, we want our money back, which is the whole point of a bank. Except they didn't have $6 billion sitting around waiting to go out. They had all these securities that were all down 10%. So they had to sell the securities, and then they took a big hit. And then people started realizing that they weren't doing well, and people start pulling their deposits. We saw Coinbase say, we're not going to bank with Silvergate anymore. We don't think it's a good idea. They're having trouble. And it's boom. It is literally a run on the bank, not because of insolvency, which was the case with the savings and loans, but because of illiquidity. So in the end, I expect Silvergate's equity holders to probably get a little bit back. They're liquidating. It wouldn't surprise me if they got, I think the stock's probably around $3 a share. It wouldn't surprise me if they got $3 or even $4.
That's
or even
why it's a
$6.
3, 4, not a 0. Right?
Yes, is that and it'll all be on how effectively they can liquidate. And we know they can't liquidate super effectively, or else they wouldn't have gotten into this trouble. And I don't expect Silicon Valley Bank to end up in receivership or to liquidate, but they're basically down 80%, and way more from their peak. I think the stock is at 80 and it was over 320, so down. Now I'm getting the numbers mixed up. I didn't look at it carefully enough. I didn't anticipate the question, but it's the exact same story. Is the deposits so startup companies put deposits at Silicon Valley Bank, and then they start spending them. And so those balances go down, but there are new startups coming in and they're putting more. And what had been happening is there's just more startups with more money, and more startups with more money, huge piles of money. And now the startups are taking out money, and the taking out has accelerated because things have slowed down, and the flows in have decelerated. And suddenly your pile of money is shrinking. Instead of lots more coming in than was going out, lots more is going out that's coming in. And you have to replace those deposits. And once people start talking about the problem, it becomes a real problem, because now if I'm a VC firm and I've got $60 million sitting in Silicon Valley Bank for my next investments, I'm thinking maybe I should move that because it's going to be an issue for Silvergate's depositors. It's deposit insurance has limits. Now on non-interest bearing accounts, those limits are really moot. But if a bank gets into trouble, it might be that you can't get your money for a week. And that's when the investment round was happening. And now everything, might as well just take it out and put it with JP Morgan Chase, because this is not going to happen with JP Morgan Chase.
So this is a classic bank run. I mean, this is the same thing as we saw in the 19th century, and it's just a little bit more sophisticated now.
It is for different reasons. And I think they're unique to these two banks because they had very narrow business models. And it was, in a sense, and I did not see this coming in advance, but in hindsight, it's in a sense that they were built with negative feedback. Because as long as Bitcoin was going up, Silvergate was going to do great. They're going to have lots of deposits. Their Bitcoin loans, which turned out not to be really a problem, were going to continue to grow. And there was going to be really nothing between them and growth except for capital requirements. But once crypto turns down, particularly if people lose faith in crypto, it was predictable if crypto became unpopular that most of their deposits would leave. And so at the exact time that their business was melting down, they would have a liquidity crisis. And that's a recipe for failure. And kind of the same thing with Silicon Valley. And that's why when we started, when you first raised this a little while ago, I said, this is really a fallout from having zero interest rates for so long, because you get the sense that this is the normal. And it's no problem to have $12 billion in intermediate term treasuries. They're super safe because what could go wrong? And the same thing with Silicon Valley Bank is it's sort of predictable that if interest rates go from 0 to who knows where they're going to go, let's say it's 6%, that it's going to impact the startup ecosystem, and not in a good way. So you're going to get hit on both sides.
So what's a little surprising is, Silvergate, I get it. They were dabbling in something completely new and exciting and all the way up. And just to be clear, they weren't buying crypto, right? They weren't investing directly in crypto. They can't as a bank. They're not allowed to. They were taking deposits and issuing loans to the industry. But
The loans were tiny, and those haven't been the problem. The
It's
problem is
mainly the deposits, which is
they bought $12 billion worth of securities that today are only worth $10 billion.
what's interesting to me is Silicon Valley Bank, which has been around forever. I mean, not forever, but it's for a very long time. Silicon Valley, back to the probably late 80s, certainly in the 90s, I remember them being a significant player in Silicon Valley. They've had the same business model throughout. And even they got suckered into the zero interest rate environment. And maybe there's just no way around it. Maybe it's kind of a trap that once you have this flat yield curve at zero, screwy things are going to happen.
Well, with this particular business model, so if you think about the model of banking, this was a problem for everyone at zero interest rates. But if you're making loans, you can say, you know what, I'm not going to make you a loan unless you pay me 3.5%. And your borrowers,
interest rates are zero, no matter
even
what.
though interest rates are zero. So we call these floors. And the borrower is going to be, well, I would like to lower rate, but 3.5% is really low. I'm cool with that. But when you go to the treasury market, it's a global market. You can't say, okay, I'm not going to buy anything that doesn't pay 3.5% unless you're willing to take credit risk or interest rate risk. And this is exactly the problem that money market funds had is, money market funds take people's money and then they pay them the yield on their underlying securities. So they invest them in really safe stuff like commercial paper and treasuries and then they take a little piece to cover their expenses and then make it a profitable business. Well, that didn't work for years. And so most of the money market funds were either not truly money market funds or they were loss leaders for larger companies. So, Fidelity or Vanguard would say, yeah, we're going to offer a money market fund and we're just going to eat the fact that it's going to cost us 6 basis points a year because we need to offer a money market fund. And they weren't that popular because they were paying basically zero interest, just like everything else. But if you're a bank and you have a full set of overhead and you want to keep the organization in place, and you can't be a loss leader at Silicon Valley Bank, you kind of have to. Now, the trouble is that both these banks, my objection to that, giving them that pass, is both these banks were extremely profitable before it hit the fan. Yep. And that means that they got greedy, that they reached for enough yield, not to just survive zero interest rates, but to thrive in zero interest rates, which meant that they were going to get slammed if rates went up quickly, particularly now that we can see that it was going to hit them on both sides, not just their interest rate losses, but their overall business was going to deteriorate at exactly the same time. Yeah. And the crazy thing, Yaron, is that both of their models, if you were starting today,
you'd make a lot of money.
Because there's still, even though there's a lot less venture capital money, there's still lots of venture capital money, even though there's less crypto deposits.
0% interest rate.
They'll still accept 0% interest rate. Crypto deposits is going to be really hard in the United States, but there are going to be people who are looking for a way to deposit dollars and access crypto. And if you could provide those things, starting from scratch, you would have zero cost deposits, and now you can invest in treasuries at 5%. Your spread is huge; it's wildly profitable. But
so we should be buying up the assets of Silvergate
We should start a crypto bank.
Start a crypto bank right now.
Yeah, probably we should wait at least a year for things to settle down before doing that. But there is an opportunity if you could provide legitimate service. Because if you look at, basically, this is what stablecoins provide. They provide a way to hold effectively dollars. But if you look at the stablecoins, none of them are like banks. None of them are, you can have your money back whenever you ask for it. We have fully audited and we're 100% there. All the stablecoins are, we've seen stablecoins blow up. And I assert with a fair amount of confidence, we'll see more stablecoins blow up because everybody would have been reaching for yield until recently. And if you get through the transition, it's a wildly profitable business, but the transition is what blows people up.
Yeah. And I think we're still in the midst of that transition. We're not on the other side of it yet.
Definitely. Rates are still going up and we have no idea when they're going to stop.
Nope. All right. Let's see. Michael asked, thank you, Ian. That was a great question to get us going. This one's out of left field. So I don't know what we do with this. Do you think it's a sign of decay in our culture that people are dressing down at work? Michael, you're asking the wrong people here. There are aspects of popular dress that reflect egalitarianism as an ideal. Nobody looks too fancy. And if you do, then it's some sort of pretentiousness.
Yeah. So
Robert was the first guy I ever met who went to university and taught in shorts at California. I don't think I ever got to that point. Today I would, but I think in those days I dressed up relative to you, down relative to everybody else.
Yeah, I actually have something to say about it only because I've been so bad most of my life. So I have a friend who said something to me maybe 5 years ago because we were talking and he was just dressed sharp, tailored suit, and there was absolutely no reason for him to be dressed sharp. I mean, he was working, but he certainly wasn't trying to impress me. And I said, "You just like to dress up? Because, if I can get that." He said, "No, I got the advice at one point to dress for the job that you want." And I took that to heart. I just don't want a job, a different job.
Right.
But I think that I wouldn't call it a sign of decay, because I think that there are a lot of ways to express your ambition and your willingness to do whatever it takes to get something done. And dressing the part is one of them, but it's not the only one. I suspect, and then now I'm just flapping my lips, but that work from home has completely changed, and not that we're not in a permanent equilibrium, that we're not going to go back with everyone wearing yoga pants to work. But
it is interesting. I mean, we started out in our careers when I remember going to New York, and you had to wear a suit and tie, and everybody wore a suit and tie, and it was just accepted. But in Silicon Valley, you didn't. You could be pretty casual in Silicon Valley, and Silicon Valley has infected the rest of the world. I mean, I go to London now, and nobody wears a suit and tie. In New York, certainly nobody does, or very few people do. And I personally view it as a positive because it allows me to dress down, which I enjoy. But I also, I don't know, there's a stuffiness to it, and there's a kind of there's a tradition bound to a particular type of dress. And there's much more individualization, something like that, in people's ability to dress what's comfortable and work in comfortable clothes. Right? Work is hard.
Arguably, we've replaced the uniform just with something a lot more casual. The hoodie versus
it was
the
a
suit
uniform.
jacket.
It was a uniform.
And it was actually, it's a funny but related story, irrelevant to everyone else's life. But so I didn't have a lot of fancy clothes when I became a portfolio manager, and we had partners who were very dialed into expectations and appearances. And so I came home one day and found 2 giant boxes from Brooks Brothers.
Yep.
They had given up telling me to go get nicer clothes. They just sent me nicer clothes.
Send it to you.
And there's something to be said for having the uniform, but I agree with you that I find it to be an improvement to have a broader spectrum of what's acceptable. And I wouldn't include slovenly, despite the fact that I'm often slovenly. I would not include that in it from a business setting.
Well, it reminds me of IBM. Remember, IBM used to have a uniform. It was a dark suit, white shirt, red tie, and there was this sudden. But there were, in that, at least the sense was in the 1980s that was reflective of a kind of a.
Well, you remember the Apple, the commercial, the Big Brother commercial.
Yep. That they were part of Big Brother. They were stayed. They weren't going to innovate. They weren't growing. They weren't doing anything exciting. And Apple, on the other hand, was the exact opposite extreme, because the stories are that when Steve Jobs would go and raise money, I mean, he often hadn't showered in a couple of weeks because he went through this period where he didn't believe in showering. and he had long hair, and so he stunk, and he was a complete mess. And what's amazing is that he still raised money, and that's a testament to Silicon Valley and to Steve Jobs probably, but to the fact that they weren't. He couldn't have raised money from IBM. He couldn't have raised from that type of person. Couldn't have raised money in New York. It had to be from a new type of, and these are the first venture capitalists, a new type of financier who paid attention to something different. And so I think that's an improvement. Although, yes, I mean, I'm not sure I would want. Luckily, Steve Jobs grew up and created his own kind of uniform and look, right? The turtleneck and the very sharp look. But it was uniquely his. It wasn't something that he just copied from everybody else. All right, let's see. This is on the same topic. Jennifer says, my dad said he was proud to finally get to wear the long doctor's coat instead of the short intern coat. Yeah, when uniforms involve promotion or really explicit status symbol, then they're really important. There's no question. They remind me, Jennifer, of, Robert might remember this, but I think the first time my mom and dad came to visit us in San Jose when I was a professor, and somebody called and asked for Dr. Brook. My mom got really upset because, like, my dad was a Dr. Brook, right? I mean, because he had earned it because he got a medical degree, and how dare I use that terminology? So I don't, right? Just nobody calls me doctor anymore. Hasn't in a long time. All right, let's see. All right, this is a question to me. It looks like, Robert, you can answer it too. Do you typically watch movies or listen to music on long flights? What's your strategy to not be bored since you fly so often? And will we see supersonic commercial aircraft in our lifetime? What do I do on long flights? So I used to read. I mean, it's a great time to just pick up a book and read, and that used to be the case, and then the internet completely screwed that over. So now I mostly watch movies. I watch video. I'm usually tired when I'm flying. Reading is a little bit too much of an effort for me these days, so I find it just laying back and watching something. But either reading, watching, or listening to a book on tape is how I deal with kind of long, tedious tasks. Like working out, I listen to books on tape when I work out. I try not to do those long tasks without something going on. How about you, Rob?
Well, I don't fly nearly as much,
No.
but I do fly, and I do fly between California and Puerto Rico, which is a journey in itself.
Yeah.
And it's funny because I'm all about connection, but I'm also committed to being disconnected.
Mhm.
I'm terrible at email. Since we started using Teams internally, I basically don't check email. I don't have my work email on my phone. I do not ever connect to the internet on a flight. And my wife, it drives my wife crazy because I have my ringer turned off on my phone, and I usually don't know where my phone is. If I'm around the house, if I'm, and that's because I think it's very important to have time where you're not being interrupted. I find it both productive and also restorative. And a flight is an obvious thing for me. I will sometimes watch movies, although I have, now with streaming, we have access to movies. So it used to be that you get on the flight and you'd be like, oh, I finally get to see this movie because, you hadn't gone to a theater.
Yeah.
And now I typically read, and it can be, if I'm tired, I'll sleep. But it can be a time where I am just not interrupted except by those stupid announcements that
I download a TV series I want to binge watch and just binge watch it on the flights. It's the one time where I have a block of time which just I'm not doing anything. So let's see. Adam asked, did commercial aircraft, a supersonic commercial aircraft in our lifetime?
Well, I certainly hope so, because we absolutely should. If you think about the aircraft industry, it's been an extraordinary success in terms of making planes more reliable and safer. I mean, it's literally been over 20 years since we had a fatal crash from a major US airliner. And you think about you're flying 200 tons of metal at 5 miles in the sky over thousands of miles and thousands of times a day, and no fatal crashes for 2 decades.
Yeah.
That is it. I don't want to take anything away from that. And the rest of the flying experience is basically unchanged or,
Or
arguably
worse.
worse.
Yeah.
Although cost adjusted, I think it's probably better. But the fact that we haven't seen progress in terms of the speed of travel makes me, I'm very suspicious. And I'm afraid whatever has stopped that in the past is going to continue stopping it. And given that the world has gotten smaller, we're better connected without actually physically being together. I don't know that the impetus is there to overcome whatever that barrier is. So I absolutely hope so, because what we learn is how to make planes go much, much faster, but it requires advances in materials or engine efficiency, and those spill over into other areas. And sometimes the biggest impact ends up being not what you originally were looking for. And we miss out on that when we're not doing things. So this gets down to, how are we going to learn how to, make new materials other than what SpaceX is doing and figuring out that stainless steel is a great way to build spaceships. Well, you have to try a lot of things, and supersonic travel, outside of the military has just been completely neglected.
So I'm optimistic because there's just so many projects right now, that seem to be moving forward. And NASA has a project, Boom has a project. There's at least one other company that's doing it. The airlines are investing. We'll see. I mean, it can always be killed, but it really does look like the technological breakthroughs have been made, and now it's a matter of getting the regulators on board and getting the noise issues dealt with, and then making sure it's economic. That's the other thing. Is it economic? All right. Adam asked, did U.S. lose its comparative advantage? And he takes as an example here, AMSL, the Dutch company that had to stay in Europe because of U.S. antitrust, immigration restrictions, etc.
I think that, so it's unfortunate that the world doesn't seem to be going the way that I had hoped it would. Yep. Where thinking about a U.S. competitive advantage would make no sense. I think that we made a choice. It was sort of a choice we didn't have to make, because the United States is a big enough country that we could be completely isolated. If we were North Korea, well, not with all the craziness, but just being isolated, we would be a lot less rich, but we'd still be very rich. And most countries can't do that, but we made the choice that we were going to, particularly with our allies, we were going to treat it like this is one world. And so I think the question I would ask is, so first of all, no, because we would not be as advanced if we were not tapping the rest of the other 7.6 billion people out there. We would not be as advanced. That's when I say we wouldn't be as rich. I don't mean just money. I mean everything in life. But we do seem to have with Russia invading the Ukraine and with China, continually threatening this South China Sea and Taiwan, and Taiwan being so important in the semiconductor food chain. We do seem to be splitting into two distinct parts of the world, or two poles. I don't know what the best way to say it, but definitely Europe is part of our group, and so I wouldn't say that we've lost our advantage. In fact, if you think of it as a bipolar world, our team has enormous advantages and is starting to use them against China, and I think that's a horrible outcome. I don't know that there's a choice. I'm not an expert on this. I can see arguments for why this would make sense, but it's definitely a second best outcome. Ideally, we wouldn't be talking about US's competitive advantage. We talk about comparative advantage, but not about competitive advantage, because we would all be working together.
Yeah. And I think, while the US probably does lose some, I'd say immigration restrictions right now are definitely a barrier to US success, even in the context with China. I mean, a lot of Chinese would move to the US and be incredibly productive over here. But ASML is an example of a company that, for example, they buy their lasers from US companies. So the US company comparative advantage is the laser, right? But they buy their lenses from a German company. And I'm just not sure it would be worthwhile for the US to try to mimic kind of German expertise in mirrors and lenses, given that Germans have been doing this for 150 years and they're really, really, really good at it. You've got Leica, you've got Weiss, or whatever they call it. You know, you've got so many German good lens companies. So ASML but puts it all together. And of course, where did the idea come from for the most sophisticated machines that ASML makes? It came from Intel. So Intel basically not gave exactly, but traded with ASML and gave them that idea. It knew it couldn't develop it internally, so it let ASML do it. I think US companies could benefit from it if they had the right attitude towards it. Why Intel declined the way it did is a good question that probably has to do a lot with corporate culture, but I'm not sure we have the answers for that. I don't know if you have any thoughts on why Intel is not at the top of their game anymore.
Well, I think it's very hard to, Intel was trying to be a generalist, and that's very hard to do because you have to be number one in every area. And once you're not, then you're at a disadvantage from someone who is buying number one or putting number one together. So Apple's a good example of, Apple is the leading smartphone company. There's no question about that. But is Apple the leading everything that goes into a smartphone? Is it the leading touchscreen company? Is it the leading chip company? Is it the leading radio company? Is it the leading? No. They're continually developing their capabilities, and they are leaders in design and putting it all together. And they are leaders, I'm sure, of different components of it. But that's the model that generally is more successful than if you were going to use only homegrown for everything. And Intel, they gave up on the manufacturing equipment, which makes sense. I mean, to be number one in semiconductor manufacturing equipment and semiconductor manufacturing and semiconductor design and semiconductor sales and marketing, and that would be unheard of, and it wouldn't last very long, even if a company were able to accomplish it. So I think it was inevitable because they didn't really pick an area of focus, and they're still doing that now. They're big into, we're going to move fabs and have fabs in the US, and if you're going to be manufacturing, then there's no reason Intel couldn't be number one. But really, they were around design of desktop processors, and that market is mature, and they didn't move into and say become number one in smartphone chips.
Well, now they're going to get a government subsidy, so who knows?
So it should only get worse.
Yes, exactly. All right. Richard asks, I see high potential value in trustworthy, curated knowledge bases for generative AI, specializing in professions like medicine. They would have deep expertise with little suspect content from the internet. What do you think?
I completely agree. I think it's very hard to predict how this is going to evolve, but as I said earlier, I think there's going to be a spectrum of AI. They're going to be broad and they're going to be narrow. They're going to be different costs and they're going to be different quality. And I do think that, and this is with no personal knowledge, this is speculation given that we're early in the curve. I do think that the training methods and the data on which to train has not been optimized, and it may be hard to figure out without just a lot of trial and error, because these sort of models they're not, what's the right way to put it? They're not deterministic in the sense of you have a bunch of if-then statements, so you know exactly what goes in and what comes out, and it's fully predictable. So if you'd have to experiment a lot, and I expect people will, particularly, as the cost of computing continually goes down, and hopefully that'll continue. There's no reason to think that won't continue. And if we ever solve the cost of electricity, which is a whole nother ball game, we talked about airplanes flying through the air and never crashing, but we can't build a nuclear power plant that would be fully, monitored, or even your car. Like it used to be, cars would break down, they just would. And now you buy a car and you drive it for 10 years, you get the oil changed once a year, you don't do anything, and it just keeps working with no maintenance. So if you combined, a stationary asset like a nuclear power plant with high level maintenance like an airplane, it has to be better than an airplane. So no problems. I mean, 20 years, maybe it's no problems in 200 years. But if we could get the energy costs down, because a lot of as you train these models, a lot of the cost is just running massive amount of computing cycles. Then you could experiment and you could say, okay, well, let's go and let's just train one on the broad internet, and it's going to come back hallucinating like crazy, just because that's the internet for you. And let's train one on the technical journals, and maybe select blogs, and you could try 10 different ways of doing it and see what the different results are. And then we'd start learning how to make generative AI more reliable. And when I say generative, I mean generative knowledge AIs as opposed to creative AIs.
All right, thanks, Richard. All right, Martin says, good evening from Liechtenstein. Wow. Low VAT on super chats here. That's good. Low VAT is always good. What's your explanation for the US having the largest companies and the most radical innovations? And what are the most radical innovations you can think of outside the US?
Let's just go one at a time. So Silicon Valley, and some of that is accidental, and some of it is just fortuitous, and some of it is by design. Mm-hmm. The fact that there was a major technology industry through the defense industry and Hewlett Packard in the 60s already, that there were major research universities, particularly Stanford, that was very, very open to the idea of working in the on applied problems. And then combined with generally great weather, although it's been terrible for the last 2.5 months, it was a magnet for people who were interested in working on these technology, and then everyone stayed. There was never a reason to leave. You can imagine going to Manhattan and getting rich and having a really great time, but then people end up leaving. They have families, they might only move to Connecticut or New Jersey, but they might move to Florida. Well, in the Bay Area, that was never the case. And so you got a critical mass of finance, engineering talent, management talent, and then it becomes a positive feedback loop. Then more people come, and it just sucks people in. I don't think if you take Silicon Valley out, I don't think the US is that different. Now, if you excised it today, like with a massive earthquake, the US would still be different because it's spread. You have, venture clusters in Austin, Texas, and in Seattle, and in Southern California, and in New York. And it's all fed on the same thing, where you get enough people that it starts attracting more. It would be terrible if that happened to Silicon Valley. It'd be terrible for the US, it'd be terrible for the planet. But my point is that I think that really explains why the US is different, because it's a sense like a virus infected the country as a whole, and is infecting other countries. It's infecting India. I thought it was infecting China. Unfortunately, I'm not sure. Maybe I shouldn't be using a virus example at this point, but the most exciting innovations outside of the US, Yaron, can you pull something out? I mean, they're definitely the
fintech out of Europe. Europe leads in fintech, I think, partially because there's less banking regulation there.
But what? Give me an example. I was going to say mRNA was, a big chunk of it was developed in Germany.
Yeah, but almost all the basic research was in the US.
That's
almost
true.
All of it. Some of the some of the Chinese companies, but it's not, none of it is radical innovation. I can't think of a radical innovation. CRISPR was a collaboration between US and Europe. So if you think about the two people who won the Nobel Prize, it's a Italian, she's Italian.
I thought she was
and
French.
an American. French.
But yeah.
French and an American, but there were labs in Europe clearly working on this at the same time as the American labs. But once you go outside of Europe, you don't see it. But even Europe, they might be good at the research, but it doesn't come to fruition in companies. I think that has something to do with the culture we talked about earlier about failure. I mean, I agree with Robert in terms of Silicon Valley being the driver of modern innovation. There's no question about that. But America's always led in innovation, even before Silicon Valley. And I think that has to do with the individualistic freedom and an attitude towards failure that just is new. It just didn't exist in the world, particularly not, pre-industrial revolution. Failure was just not, failure was you died if you failed. I mean, it was a life or death thing. And America, it changed in the 19th century. And that's why America was a place of innovation back then. It continued in Silicon Valley, and it really hasn't picked up in a huge way anywhere else. There's no cluster like that anywhere else.
I agree. And I think a lot of it has to do with specialization because, people, first of all, people left because of the world wars, but people would leave Europe and immigrate to do things because it made more sense to be trying it in the US or in Silicon Valley specifically.
And that goes back to Adam's point about immigration. I mean, immigration has been crucial to American success, and restraining immigration definitely will hurt that. It takes away an element of connectivity.
Yes, anything that reduces connectivity should be off the table in terms of a policy. Fortunately, the impact is a lot less than it would have been, even 20 years ago, much less 50 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
But that's no excuse for sacrificing connectivity in the pursuit of some other, even questionable, definitely questionable, but even if it was a reasonable goal. But I think that the connectivity explains a lot of it in the sense of, a lot of scientific knowledge came out of Europe and in the 20th century. And it was able to be commercialized and turned into actual innovations because of that connection. And, that's even more true today. So I don't know that it matters that much. I mean, I don't want to sacrifice connectivity or a supportive environment anywhere. But as long as you have places where people can go to express their ingenuity in every way that, whatever way it is that they're going to express it, I think you end up with a pretty good result.
Yeah, I mean, the decline in China is primarily a fear now that people will not be able to express that ingenuity without government permission, and that's what authoritarianism does,
which is an oxymoron.
Yeah. All right, Harper Campbell asks, how come we haven't had a Great Depression since 1929? Have economists learned something, or are we just growing faster than they can kill us?
Well, I definitely believe in the latter, although I don't think it's the reason for this particular question. I think that despite the best efforts of people to ruin things, ingenuity generally wins out and people just find a way to thrive under the new environment. Yaron can probably answer this better than I can, but I'll put my 2 cents in as that the Great Depression was a horrible mistake. Macroeconomics has not advanced that much, but enough that we probably won't make the same horrible mistake again. But we'll see.
Yeah, I mean, my view is macroeconomics has advanced to the point where they know how to avoid the big collapses, and there's a trade-off between one big collapse and just lower economic growth instead of So I think we've gotten really, really good at spreading out the pain over many decades instead of feeling it all at once. I remember first realizing that during the SNL crisis when the government kind of it took on $300 billion of debt, which was a lot back then, and paid off people. And then they took, 30 years to pay it off. And in a sense, wow, that's pretty cool. And nobody felt the deep pain that you would have had if you'd had to take the loss all at once. You'd had to write it off all at once. So yes, we've gotten better at avoiding pain. Veldrin asked, the mixed economy has done wonders in the last 40 years, Google, Amazon, Apple. We need to stop demonizing it. It's leading to the rise of fascist right, or the fascist left, or everybody in between. All right. Apollo Zeus says, investing in green tech and the morality of it. So what do you think about investing in green tech?
Well, I am pretty sure that green tech has already been absorbed in the same way that organic and every other positive connotation label has been, and that people are doing largely the same things, largely the same things. They're just coloring it green, which is one of the ways that Ingenuity gets around some of this nonsense. I do think that, by my definition of green tech would be it's more resource efficient. That makes perfect sense. I mean, a lot of what is making the world a better place now is doing more with less. Mm-hmm. And so I'm all in favor of that. Unfortunately, it's generally just an excuse to dole out money to favored constituencies. Yep.
Justin asks who's my guest next week. That's Peter Schwartz. Okay, this is, so Boaz asked the same question of every guest I have on. Feel free to answer any part of this you want to, because there's no way you can answer all of it. Okay, tips for burnt out parents of my 9-month newborn. How do we gain back focus? And then thoughts on Bitcoin, NFT, tech layoffs, China, Russia, housing crisis, AR, VR, and Elon Musk.
Wow, we're going to have to go back and do this one at one. So be willing to get help for a 9-month-old. Yep. I with confidence say that you'll look back and wish that you had some of these days back. And I totally get that having them all in a row, I have experienced having them all in a row is not optimal, but that's how the world works. Yep. But what I learned was being willing to ask for and to hire help makes all the difference, because it's the last 10% of what's taxing you that is really the pain, and the rest is at least halfway enjoyable. Yep. In terms of regaining focus, you have to get enough sleep, which you're probably not getting, it sounds like. But I have find that we live in a world where there's just like a massive drain on your focus, just ongoingly from many different directions, very subtly and in ways that reward you. So, I said I keep my phone off, I don't do email, and I don't do social media, except I started reading Quora for no good reason, and they're very good at hooking you. So I had to stop. Like, it would be like if I was waiting somewhere, I'd say, oh, this, just learn some trivia. It's fun. It's a rabbit hole. It's a bottomless rabbit hole. So now I just can't do it. And I would, my experience is that if you look at your life and you say, what are the things that are preventing me from focusing? Yeah, there's the fact I'm not getting enough sleep, and there's the fact that my kids bother me, but that's my life. That's the life I've chose. It's what are the things that have wormed their way into my life and are bleeding me dry of my focus, and just ruthlessly get rid of them, even though it seems like you might not be able to. Like, you go, oh my God, I'm going to stop going on Twitter. Yeah, stop going on Twitter if that's what it takes. Yep. And then the whole rest of it, I think, well, first of all, I think Elon Musk is amazing in a sense that I think most people don't mean. I don't mean that he's amazingly innovative. He's started a online Yellow Pages company in the 90s, which was very successful and made him rich, but it's not that innovative. You can just move something online. He started X.com, which was an online financial services that didn't have a business model, but worked really well when paired with Confinity, and made PayPal and got really rich. And then he bought into Tesla and took over running Tesla. And then he started SpaceX, not inviting space flight. And he's got the Boring Company. Now he owns Twitter. And I am just amazed that he gets so much shit done.
Yeah.
I mean, the fact that these companies were all successful is what amazes me. The fact that nobody thought commercializing space flight was even a thing to think about. Electric vehicles, like it's not that no one had the idea. It's that everyone else said, that's just a dead end. And he's actually made stuff happen. And so of all 8 billion people on the planet, I think he's the most effective at getting things done. And that, being number one out of 8 billion says something. And the rest of the shit posting tweets and all of that, that's, if he wants to have that be his life, more power to him. But getting things done, that is amazing. Even if it's pissing people off, like he's incredibly good at getting things done. And then the rest of technology, I think it's a mistake to try and predict the future. I think it is, and I don't mean like a life-threatening mistake or a terrible mistake, or it's kind of fun to talk about, speculate how what the world would look like, but the world is not going to show up. The weather shows up, and predicting the weather is incredibly frustrating if you're trying to do it more than 3 days out. Yep. And the future doesn't just show up. The future is what we make of it. And some of it is like the weather. I'm not going to go out and design new technologies for electric cars and autonomous driving. It's just going to show up. And I could tell you what I think about that. But really what matters is from a technology perspective is, what are you going to do with those technologies? What are you going to do with powerful chatbots? What are you going to do with powerful VR, AR systems? And you don't have to figure it out now, but it's worth speculating about, because at some point you're going to need to figure it out. And of course, the Ingenuism way is to try things and experiment and try using it one way and another, find out what makes you more fulfilled, more satisfied, more productive, more whatever it is you're trying to get out of it, and be willing to say, you know what, I'm not doing this. It's not aligned with what I'm really trying to accomplish, and then try something else. That's where technology really impacts your life. Is what use can you personally do to put the technology to use as that really gets you what you want and furthers your goals.
Mm-hmm. That's good. All right, last questions, I think. How is the state of productivity in the Western world nowadays?
Well, if you believe the numbers, terrible.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure that believing the numbers makes sense. One problem with productivity is it's measured in terms of dollars, but what you want is productivity in life.
Yep.
And historically, dollars, and even today, it's a nice objective way to measure it, and it is a pretty good metric. And so I don't have any problem with that. But if you think, and Mark and Dreesen made this point recently, but it's a kind of point that has been around for decades. There's even a term, Baumol cost tragedy or whatever, cost disease, is that areas that become more productive become cheaper. So, the amount of computing power that we have is maybe 1 billion times what it was 30 years ago. And we're spending more money on it, but we're spending maybe 1,000 times as much. So the productivity has been like 1,000,000x. And again, I'm making up these numbers, but they're also not wrong. They're basically ballpark. Versus, my career as an educator, I started teaching with Yaron in the university in 1993, and we basically taught the same way that Socrates was teaching a couple thousand years earlier. And now 30 years later, I'm largely not doing that because it hasn't changed at all. You're still doing now, and I'll take that back a little bit. Part of it was the pandemic. The teaching I do now is online, and there are new tools and everything, but it's changed a tiny fraction of what could possibly happen, and what it has, and compared to the changes that have happened elsewhere in the economy. So the productivity statistics are measuring something, and what they're measuring is the fact that government, education, some areas of healthcare have not been advancing. There's been very little progress. And they have become, because of that, of the cost of what we do, they have become a bigger and bigger part of it. So a lot of it is just mathematical, inevitable, when you allow major sectors of the economy to
Stagnate.
Exactly.
Excellent. Good. So thanks, Robert. I'll remind everybody that you can follow our discussions about Ingenuism on the Ingenuism channel on YouTube. You can go to Substack, so ingenuism.com, to get more material over there. You can also, it's also a podcast, so you can go to whatever podcast app you use and get it there. Thank you to all the super chatters. This has been great. You can support the Yaron Brook Show on Patreon, Subscribestar, and yaronbrookshow.com/support. And I mean, I guess it's early evening where you are, Robert, but it's late at night here in Puerto Rico, although it's going to get narrower.
This weekend.
Starting this weekend. That's right. This weekend. Great. We'll talk. I'll see you tomorrow. We'll talk tomorrow. Bye, everybody. See you all tomorrow. Bye.